Thank you, Chris. It's my job now to complete our presentation with the policy perspective. I will talk about two topics: services policy and regulation, and then the reforms that are needed. Okay. So when we look at what Chris has just told us, this story about the development of the Indonesian services sector, then we ask the question about why is the performance less than desired. Then we ask the question about the role of policy. And first of all, just in general, services sectors tend to be regulated because of the simultaneity of consumption and production. So when you consume banking services, for instance, the production and consumption is simultaneous. And the provider, which is the banks, needs to be regulated to make sure that the consumer is getting the right level of service delivery and so on. So that tends to be the first reason for regulation. And then services sector tend to have first mover advantage and major players, dominant players. So to regulate for competition, many countries have a lot of competition issues with telecom, with banking and so on. So it tends to also have a lot of regulations. And it tends to be sensitive. Whether you talk about education, whether you talk about health, and it tends to be sensitive because of the dominant role of incumbents or state-owned enterprises and the need to protect local professionals in the name of national interest. And sometimes there's also the cultural aspect, the local aspect that people want to protect. So that's why there tends to be a lot of regulation in the services sector. And this is one of the issues for Indonesia, that we tend to have a very restrictive regime. And the outcome is, as Chris has already explained, lack of competition and inefficient and high cost of provision of services, leading to a lack of incentive for contracting out and a low share of services in exports and the lack of our participation in global value chain. And data has always been a problem for services sector, but increasingly we are getting more and more data, including with the trade in value-added data that has come out with the OECD and the World Bank. And we do also have a lot of reviews and surveys of policy regimes in different countries so that we can compare policy regimes between countries. And one of the useful databases that a lot of researchers are using now is this OECD and World Bank database called Services Trade Restrictiveness Index, STRI. And it is 2011, if I'm not mistaken. Did they update it, Chris? Not yet. So it's kind of one point in time, but it does need to be updated regularly. At the moment, the last survey they did was in 2011. And this is the picture for Indonesia. And Indonesia has a relatively restrictive policy regime. So the line that you see is the policy regime of BRICS countries as comparison. And the bars are Indonesia. And it's a bit small for you to see, but 1 to 22 are different services sector. So for most sectors, we are more restrictive, and the higher the number, the more restrictive your regime is, based on restrictions on foreign entry, restrictions to movement of people, regulatory transparency, and barriers to competition and other discriminatory measures. And you can see that, is there a pointer on this thing? I'm not sure how to work this pointer. Anyway. Oops. Anyway, the green, I just use color code. The green is restrictions on foreign entry, and the one right above it, which is purple, is restrictions to movement of people. So those two are the main restrictions in our policy regime. And you can see that number 1 and number 2 are the most restrictive, which is motion pictures and legal. But as you know, in the last DNI or negative list, actually motion pictures, there were some deregulation in the motion pictures in terms of production and cinema, which is the distribution component. So if you actually did an update, that one would probably look better, and so on. So, but you can see that the main restriction is coming from restrictions on foreign entry and restrictions to movement of people. And some of the restrictive sectors that are important for competitiveness, such as air transport and telecommunication, freight and cargo, are more restrictive compared to other BRICS countries. So we have a relatively restrictive regime compared to BRICS countries, and you can also see this other diagram that correlates restrictiveness of the regime to how much your export has a services content, which is one of the measures that we use to measure competitiveness of the services sector of any country. And there is a negative correlation, that is, the more restrictive your regime, the less you have services export content. And in this picture, which is interesting, there are two outliers for very different reasons. India is an outlier in the positive sense, that even though they have a restrictive regime, they have a high export content. And I think you explained that with the fact that India has focused a lot on IT delivery, IT services, such as software, call centers, and so on. And in that particular area of the services delivery and trading services, it is not very restrictive, but the rest is fairly restrictive. That's, I think, one explanation. But Indonesia, unfortunately, is below the trend. It is having a much lower services content, export services content, even though it's restrictive, but it's below the trend compared to other countries. So why is that? So we try to analyze why is there a low share of services in exports. Okay, thank you. Yeah. So, how do we explain the low share in services in exports? The correlation shows that the restrictive regime is related to the low share in exports, but there are also other factors that contribute. The composition of exports, because Indonesia has a dominance of commodities, minerals, fuels, and so on, and the cost of contracting out, which Chris has already pointed out. So to get to the bottom of the story, going beyond correlation, we did some econometric analysis, regressing the share of services in exports to the restrictiveness index, the composition of exports, and the cost of contracting out, and also with some control variables. And the results are very interesting. It shows that STRI, or the restrictiveness index, is really telling you a lot of the story about the variation in the services share in exports. But export composition also is significant, although less important than the restrictiveness regime. And the cost of contracting out is also important. And here is where the importance of institutions. So if you want to contract out, as Chris already pointed out, you need to make sure that your contracts are going to be honored. So the rule of law and the certainty of policy, which is again related to the policy regime, becomes very important, as well as, of course, the human resources. So this is all really to build up the story that reforms are needed, because the restrictiveness of the regime is really what's causing the problem. Let's just talk a little bit about a case study that we thought would be interesting to show the importance of the restrictiveness regime and the negative impact it can have on many fronts. Health services. I think the minister earlier talked about education, and it's quite a similar story. So both health and education are sensitive sectors because of many reasons, including the professions that are in it, the incumbent players, and so on. And Indonesia is a significant net importer of both health and education. But for health, I actually got some of these numbers from Ministry of Health estimates. that in 2006, 350,000 people spent $500 million getting medical treatment abroad. And in 2012, this number had jumped to 600,000 and 1.4 billion. The evidence is that significant restrictions, little change in commitments in international agreements, and gaps between actual policy and commitments has led to the lack of development of an internationally competitive health sector in Indonesia. And this can be compared to our other ASEAN neighbors, especially Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand, which have, for the last maybe 10, 20 years, developed health tourism in a big way by building these sectors through cooperation with providers, domestic and foreign, private, and relaxing participation in the health sector to private and foreign providers. And this is important. Access to medical staff, so allowing foreign professionals to practice in your country. And of course, all this goes without saying, you have to do it in a way that is in line with international standards for hospitals as well as for the professionals. And this is important because of insurance. You have to get these ISO standards for your hospital and your staff, for the insurance companies from wherever, to allow the patients to get consume health services not in their country but in other countries, actually at a lower cost. And this is certainly the conclusion is that an open policy regime has driven exports of health services. What should Indonesia do? Some possible responses, which are actually in the works, but I think still needs a lot more work, put it that way. International standards for hospital and staff, including how to manage hospitals with hospitality. If you look at the way Thailand or Singapore or Malaysia conducts their hospitality, it's not just about the kind of the professional health level, but also the hospitality that comes with it. And when I was Minister of Tourism, between us and the Minister of Health, we have a medical tourism task force, where we talked about that. And I believe there are now 9 or 12 hospitals in Indonesia which already meet the international standards. And then we need to also think about relaxation of cooperation with providers. And this is the more sensitive issue. Can we allow medical staff from overseas to also practice here? You know, you can always confine it to the specializations that we don't have insufficient amount yet, and they should be training our doctors as well. You know, that kind of approach. And if it is too difficult to do it nationally, we may think about a special economic zone for health services or for special purposes, which when we're talking about medical tourism, this was talked about. And this includes like grey tourism, the people who are going to retire from Japan, from elsewhere. Malaysia has this program. But they need to have doctors who can speak their language, whether it's Mandarin, whether it's Japanese, definitely English, but you think about the Asian market, where the Northeast Asian countries are aging. If you talk about education, I don't know what's the estimate. Maybe somebody will know. I was just trying to calculate just then. So if you had 30,000 Indonesians studying abroad, each at $100,000 a year, I think that comes up to about 3 billion. Is that right? Did I get my math right? Something like that. But again, education is another area. So this is the potential that is lost in terms of foreign exchange, but more importantly in terms of human capital development. Let me just now close with so now what? We've established the case for the importance of the services sector. We've established the case that a lot of our lack of performance is our low level of competitiveness, our low share of services in export or as a percentage of GDP, the deficit in our export of services, the low productivity, and so on, are showing that we are just a low or middle ranking performer in the ASEAN context. And this is a story of lost opportunities. And our analysis shows that the main reason is the restrictive policy regime, even though composition of exports and cost of contracting out are also important. And we believe that this is really asking the big question. So how can we move forward on the reform process in services? I think we should be all optimistic with the tone set by the Minister of Trade just then, that there is attention to it. Now let me just make some observations about how can we proceed forward in terms of reforms in the services sector in Indonesia. If you observe reforms of the services sector in Indonesia today, I think we can make several observations. One is the lack, selamat datang Pak Emil. One is the lack of appreciation of the benefits of reform. And again, I think we cannot overemphasize this story about recognizing the important role of services in how it can make other sectors competitive and making your economy competitive. Whether it's manufacturing, whether it's tourism, whether it's agriculture, the Brebes example. And if you read the newspaper this morning, I think Jokowi, probably he announced this in Brebes, that he wants to use digital technology to inform the price of basic commodities. You know, finding the answers using technology. Services policy is complex and difficult to assess, whether it's because of data and other issues. And we have a lot of sensitivities and resistance due to adjustments by incumbents, including professionals. And obviously, many of the services sectors also are dominated by state-owned enterprises, especially in transportation, banking, and infrastructure-related services such as telecommunications. And having been minister for 7 years, part of the job is coordinating services sector, there is very complex coordination required across agencies, which does require a lot of political will and from the top. I just give you an example. When we passed the investment law in 2007, the negative list was sort of best practices in investment policy, where restrictions on foreign ownership should be regulated using the negative list. And all sectors should abide by it. But what happened was that a number of sectoral laws and sectoral regulations and domestic regulations came out which were in a way inconsistent with the spirit of the investment law. There are ownership restrictions in the education law and in the logistics law, which makes it very difficult for you to change foreign ownership restrictions because it's in the law. Health and education, a very protective approach with a lot of foreign ownership limits and limitation on movement of professionals. Even though just then we heard an optimistic note about the need to have skills training and vocational training to be opened up or to be at least accelerated if you want 10 new Balis. So let's see what will happen with that. The reforms in the ASEAN context, on paper looks good. We moved from ASEAN Framework Agreement on Services in 1995, which was part of ASEAN Free Trade Agreement. This will only make sense to the trade wonks, I think. But basically, we try to make the process or the framework of regional opening up of services much more bold. So we went from AFAS, which is just basically GATS plus, you just do a little bit more than what your GATS commitment was, to an AEC blueprint in 2006. Because AEC talks about free flow of goods, services, investment, and skilled labor, so the movement of natural persons. And appears to be very bold, because if you look at the AEC blueprint, it has very specific targets of opening up the services sector all the way to 100% by 2015, and 70% by 2010 for the priority sectors and so on, and targets for mutual recognition agreements for professionals. So very targeted, very specific, but, always but, in the case of ASEAN. But the outcome was very modest and not bold enough. If you look at each of the commitments, they fall short of really open liberalization, with some exceptions. I think people say air transport, especially for cargo and so on, have been quite positive, and there are at least more sectors included in the agreement. But it's broad but not deep, and the MRAs are there for 8 professions, but whether it's not been tested, whether they are going to be implemented. The certification is there. We have to really test whether if somebody tries to come and use it, whether it's really going to be workable or not. Tourism has probably been the most advanced with already standards and certification and on paper anyway, an ASEAN mutual recognition agreement process. And most importantly, when we talk about services, it can't just be about the foreign ownership restrictions or the movement of professionals. At the end, domestic regulations or behind the border measures which are restrictive and piecemeal opening up is really part of the big problem. International logistics, for instance, international logistics are open, but in the case of Indonesia, domestic and distribution are not open. So you are not looking at it as a group of services to make it efficient for logistics. Domestic regulations related to license to operate, domestic requirements related to language or local knowledge. I think all countries do it, but requiring your professionals to speak your language, I think is a fair enough requirement. But how you actually implement that and whether you're using it as a restriction or not is, I think, the issue. And strong preference for limiting foreign ownership in strategic sectors. And you can see and witness that in the sectoral laws and in the negative list. And so, what next? We know it's important, just to re-emphasize what Chris has already emphasized, it's crucial for us to develop the modern services sector, whether it's to diversify our economy, to take advantage of technological development, to increase competitiveness, to increase productivity, to increase as a source of exports, to enhance human capital, and to provide real jobs. I think I like the word Chris used. And this is not the employer of last resort. It's not about just the trading and the construction sector. And the increased tradability in services. So reforms are key, but they are not easy. I take heart at the optimism of the Minister of Trade. And we hope that he can, I think he had a great belief that, yes, it's difficult, but Jokowi, we hope our President, Jokowi, will be able to make the breakthroughs. And here are some recommendations. We propose 4-part approach to the reform. Increase transparency using your international commitments, capturing technology, capturing urbanization as drivers for reform. Increasing transparency and generating better policy information. I cannot overemphasize this. I think a lot of our resistance, a lot of our tendency to protect comes from the fact of not knowing very much about the services sector and its impact, and a very kind of narrow sectoral perspective. We need to understand it in a more comprehensive approach. We need to understand the negative effects of restrictiveness, which we hope we have tried to establish in this paper. And we need to monitor policy changes. Information is much more available now, and we should be using this to design and inform reforms. You know, we always talk about blueprints. Blueprints, you can be cynical about blueprints, but I think you do need a blueprint. I mean, I'll tell you 2 stories about this. One is that the Malaysian story, which I was told by a friend of mine, Xia Mei Ling, some of you may know her. She's Malaysia's, Chris Finlay, I think, Malaysia's expert on services. She told me that 20 years ago, she and a whole group of them were asked to do a services sector study on all services sector by, at that time, Mahathir. And so they did this really amazing study. And what he did was he actually put them in his drawer. And he pulled them out one by one as the time was ready for the reform to happen. But they had already this information, and in Malaysia it's part of their medium-term plan. And hey, be aware that China is also prioritizing services and innovation as the next stage, the 21st century issue. So if we don't do it, we are going to be left behind. Some lessons about implementing reforms coming from both the academic and the policy practitioner perspective, and a bit of Professor Sadli's wisdom. Good times lead to bad policies, and bad times lead to good policies. So let's hope we are in this second phase of bad times lead to good policies. World economy not doing well, domestic economy not doing well, our exports are down. Hey, this is time for reform and deregulation. And there are hopeful signs, as we heard this morning, and in the deregulation packages that have been coming out continuously since September. I think we're in number 11, are we? Number 11 or number 12? Number 12, okay. So there's some hopeful signs and recent announcements to accelerate the free trade areas, which will shape the services reform, just as the Minister of Trade has emphasized. And we saw some relaxation in the recent negative list, relaxation in the services sector, such as tourism, creative economy, especially film and healthcare. So, I'm looking at the wrong slide. That was kind of the next slide. This was what I was talking about. Let me just go back. Implementing of reforms. I think we need to think about sequencing, quick wins, islands of best practices, and pilots. That's why the notion of special economic zones, our experience with National Single Window, which we did in stages. National Single Window has a lot of services component in there. Finding champions in government, local government, and stakeholders. Ownership of the process by bureaucrats and stakeholders. And this is really what I want to emphasize of the role of ISD. The International Services Dialogue we created in 2010 exactly for this reason. And peer pressure. So even though we are rather skeptical about the AEC blueprint, they actually have very clear targets and a very clear way you can monitor it. Now, whether we can use that to our advantage and to our domestic policy is very important for us to develop that. And then finally, institutionalizing the process. This is the most difficult part, probably. How can you coordinate a whole of government with the stakeholders and, in fact, with society? You know, it's not just the stakeholders, but how the consumers, how the public can understand the whole notion of opening up the services sector, which is beneficial to them. Coordinating whole of government is important because of the comprehensive approach that you must have when you look at services sector opening up. And it has a lot of domestic regulations in there. I think evidence-based policymaking is important because you need to have that blueprint, the strategic vision. The other story that I was going to tell was when we were first negotiating services back in '95, our negotiator was a man called Marzuki Usman. And at that time, we didn't have any information on services. So if you look at our GATS commitments, it's not terribly exciting, right? So what was the reason? The reason the negotiator said, we didn't know anything about this and we didn't know what we were getting ourselves into. So the easiest thing to say is no. And that kind of stuck with me for a long time. And you know, this is why we say no, because we don't really know what is the impact and what is the potential benefits. And the clear coordination mechanism, you know, we have all these task forces and national teams, but how to make that really work? This is really the big challenge for the Ministry of Trade, and I think there is already something going on, but we hope that ISD and others can help to make that process work. We already talked about this. And finally, the shaping of reforms as part of international commitments. I think this is important. At the end of the day, reforms can only happen at the national level and unilaterally in a way. But when you do it, you should be doing it in a way that is very clear what is your national objective, what are the numbers, what are the facts and figures, where do you want to take the national services sector to. But you do it in a way not in isolation of what is the international commitments that you are going to have to enter in sometime in the near future or in the far future. But you got to be looking at it to use it to shape your reforms. And obviously we have AFAS and we have AEC. That's already there. We have RCEP. At the moment, all these are very not bold at all and not 21st century. They are Jurassic Park or 19th century FTA, as I'm just quoting the Minister of Trade, what he said this morning. If you look at TPP, that may be the 21st century. We need to go from 19th century to 21st century, maybe not in a big jump, but we need to be aware of that's the direction that's going. We have to be preparing EU, Indonesia CIPA, Australia, Indonesia CIPA, TPP, and there's some things happening in WTO also. We're going to have a surprise guest later who will speak directly about the WTO. But there's some things happening in the WTO that we should also be aware of. And I just wanted to say something about APEC and the framework of services, which was actually introduced in 2013, the year Indonesia was the chair of APEC. You may think, oh yeah, APEC, all talk, nothing happening there. But you know, I've been through this process for a long time, and I believe that it's capacity building. It's helping you to understand and frame the issues. You may not implement these policies 5-10 years later, but it's a process that you should look at. And I can reflect on the APEC non-binding investment principles, which was introduced in 1993. And we did not change our investment law till 2007, but we actually used all the principles that were in that APEC non-binding, that's kind of a APEC language, right? Investment principles. So that's just to shape our reforms. And services sector and urbanization, I think Chris mentioned it, commitment of local government is important, and how they can really create the creative hubs. And this is already happening. You talk about Jakarta, you talk about Bandung, you talk about Banyuwangi. Bandung and Jawa Barat is most advanced. They already have a blueprint for creative industries and so on. And let me just close, because I'm aware of the time. We need to leverage on disruptive technologies, and this is really the future. And I'm going to close with a film, okay? So I've learned, this is one of my new skills. Can you play the film? And then this is to give us optimism. Despite all the horror stories about reforms and restrictive regimes, this is a positive story that hopefully will make us understand what the minister was emphasizing about 21st century, that we are in the 21st century. Okay, while they're fixing the film, actually the conclusion should come after the film, but you will see that in this film it's about a designer, we call it designer kampung, and it is about how you can have this tradability in services that Pak Tom was talking about earlier, how services delivery can happen through the internet. It's about designers who live in the kampung and they deliver to the world. And it shows you that Indonesia actually has about 100 and as of February 2015, there are about 129,000 registered Indonesian designers in this platform called 99 Design, which is a platform in Australia. And well, you can watch the film, and it's all over Java. these villages are doing design from the kampong. And most of them are self-taught. They refer to themselves as logo crafters or designers. During the day, they are farmers or other professions that are very basic professions. And they have relatively low-level education, but they taught themselves how to design logo from the internet. They don't speak English, but they use Google Translate to communicate with their overseas clients. They earn for each design they get about $200, $300, but if they get and it's through competition, right? They have been able to increase their income by 10, 20 times. So it relieves poverty. So. Well, maybe we can play it at the lunch break when we figure out the sound. No sound? No sound. Okay. Balik ke presentasi aja deh. So I was just reading from. Sorry, the film is very powerful, but hopefully we can get it to work and we can play it for you during lunch. The last 3 slides, please, which summarizes actually the 1999 design. Okay, I already talked about this. So the villages are. Kayaknya kamu harus pencet. Ini nggak jalan. So they're all over Indonesia. Next. Next. Okay, so if you look at that example, unfortunately you didn't see the film to get that powerful impact, but you're talking about 130,000 people all over Indonesia whose income went from $200 a month to $2,000 a month. And it's new ways to access market and value adding, but it is about the need for developing your human resources and basic infrastructure if you want to have more of those kampung designers be able to access and deliver services globally. They need to have the electricity, no internet, right? Very basic. And banking services. They're using PayPal right now to get the payments done, and they're using one person who pulls all the income. You need community and institutions to play key roles so people can adapt and reap the benefits of technology. And Indonesia has become not only a market but also a co-creator in the digital area. Okay, market and delivery, but also co-creating, and that's the direction that we need to go to. Reforms and facilitation will be needed in investment, in attracting talent. You want the best domestic talent and foreign talent to be able to develop and create these hubs around services delivery, around global value chain, to allow innovation and clusters to develop. And I think financial services, telecom and technology infrastructure are very important to make this happen. Financial literacy and upgrading of skills and knowledge. I think this is really the key. And education, what is the role of education sector in all this? Whether you should open it up or whether you should go online, whatever. These are very, very key issues, which will, I think, if some of you know about the World Development Report, World Bank, basically their conclusion is that the digital dividends have not been equally distributed. And one of the reasons is that even though the technology is there, if you don't know how to use it, if you don't know how to benefit from it, then the gap becomes wider. So I will end on that note, and hopefully we can see the film later. Thank you.
Yes.